Hey guys, tonight we're sinking back into the sooty, gaslit cobblestone world of the Victorians, when taking an afternoon nap wasn't just a cute quirk, but a desperate necessity. Imagine this. You're trudging home through choking smog, your lungs thick with coal dust, your feet aching from hours on cracked pavement, and the only thing keeping your head from toppling off your shoulders is the fantasy of collapsing into a threadbare armchair. That's right. Before sleep was streamlined into a single efficient nighttime block, Victorians were already indulging in afternoon slumps long before it was cool. You'll hear about everything from sleepy butlers to tea time zoning out, and yes, there might be some fainting couches and suspiciously long prayer breaks involved. Honestly, you probably won't survive this era with your circadian rhythm intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and what time it is where you are. I love seeing our sleepy little globe in motion. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes to fog. Not mist, not haze, thick, yellowish fog. The kind that clings to your coat, stings your eyes, and smells faintly like burnt eggs. Welcome to London, circa 1855. It's 2:47 in the afternoon, and the sun, if you could see it, is already fighting a losing battle against industrial soot. You're walking down a lane where every breath feels like inhaling fireplace leftovers. This is not a city designed for vitality. Coal is king. It's burned in stoves, factories, even street lamps. And it's not just the air. The city is loud, overstuffed, and constantly moving. Horse-drawn carriages clatter past, vendors shout, and children dart between alleys like soot-covered squirrels. Every sound grates on your nerves. No earbuds, no white noise machines, just raw, unfiltered city. And you're exhausted. But it's not just pollution tiring you out. It's the rhythm of Victorian life itself. You're up early because daylight is precious and artificial light is weak, smoky, and expensive. Gaslight, flickering and dim. Candles, too dear for casual use. Most people rise with the dawn and do not pause until the last pot is scrubbed or the final inventory tallied. Even basic domestic chores are marathons. Doing laundry? That's a full-day event, and no, there's no spin cycle. Cooking involves open flames, iron pots, and carrying water by hand. And let's not forget the coal. You haul it, you shovel it, you clean its dusty footprints off every surface. Again. Historians still argue whether the physical exhaustion of this era was more due to poor nutrition or relentless labor, but either way, the result is the same. By early afternoon, you're wiped. And yet, no one talks about it. There's a Victorian pride in pushing through, a stiff upper lip, even when your entire body wants to melt into a chaise longue and sleep for the next 6 hours. But behind closed doors, or velvet drapes, many do exactly that. Take the average middle-class family. They've worked hard to earn a drawing room with a daybed or a settee. Mother claims she's going to read. She picks up a copy of Household Words by Mr. Dickens himself, but let's be honest, she's asleep before page 2. No shame, she calls it resting her eyes. And while it might sound like a cozy luxury now, it's often survival. The nutritional standards of the time were bleak. Breakfast might be toast and tea. Lunch, perhaps some cold meat and potatoes, if you're lucky. The afternoon blood sugar crash is inevitable. No smoothies, no power bars, just digestive biscuits and an urgent need to lie down. The city's layout doesn't help. Streets aren't just crowded, they're perilous. You dodge manure, mud, and aggressive geese. Walking is exercise, whether you like it or not. And if you work in a shop, factory, or home, you're likely on your feet for 10–12 hours a day. That's not even getting into childcare. Victorian children are either treated like tiny adults or fragile porcelain, depending on your class. Either way, it's exhausting. You try keeping a corseted toddler away from the fireplace while also mending socks and making dinner with no fridge. Good luck. The funny part? All this fatigue wasn't really acknowledged in medical terms. Oh, sure, there were vague diagnoses like nervous exhaustion or female hysteria, but no one said, "Hey, you're tired, maybe nap." Instead, they invented elaborate routines to justify midday rest. Enter the rest cure. Popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell and others, it was prescribed mostly to upper-class women, involving isolation, bed rest, and copious amounts of dairy. Sounds restful? Sure, until you realize it also meant being forbidden from reading, talking, or even sitting up. Still, in a twisted way, the medical world stumbled onto the idea that people needed more rest, just maybe without the Victorian drama. And while some scoffed at napping as laziness, others got clever about it. Clerks in shops would volunteer for stock duty in back rooms, code for sneaking 15 minutes of peace behind crates of biscuits. Domestics would take laundry breaks, just long enough to sit on a cool stone step and close their eyes. No one called it a nap, but that's what it was. Even public spaces started to reflect this need for pause. Parks like Hyde Park or Kensington Gardens weren't just for Sunday promenades. They were places where you could lean on a tree, tip your hat over your eyes, and drift for 10 blessed minutes. There's also a fringe tidbit that's oddly endearing. Some households kept nap cushions tucked behind curtains, small embroidered pillows hidden discreetly in common rooms, ready for use the moment a respectable lady needed to recover from exertion. It was like Victorian stealth napping, completely socially sanctioned as long as it looked faintly medical. And then, of course, there's the matter of the ever-present fog. Some called it pea soup. You'd call it nap justification. The air was so thick some afternoons that travel halted, shops closed early, and entire days dissolved into a greasy twilight. What else was there to do but nod off? You close your eyes again. The world muffles. Hoofbeats dull. The grime softens into quiet. Someone boils tea in the background. A fire crackles. A dog yawns beneath a side table. You can't be blamed. You were just going to sit for a minute, just to rest your eyes. A joke floats past. In the Victorian era, naps weren't an indulgence. They were self-defense. You smirk in your half-sleep. There's truth in that. After all, how else could you keep going in a world where rest was rationed and every waking moment demanded effort? Maybe that's why naps, quietly, stubbornly, seeped into the hours between noon and dinner, just enough to make life barely livable. And as we move on, remember this fog, the heaviness of it, the silence it brings, the strange comfort in its muffling grip. You'll need that memory for the naps still to come. You blink, or maybe you don't. Maybe your eyes never fully reopened after that last drift into silence. Either way, you're still here, still wrapped in the smoggy folds of Victorian life. Except now it's a different part of the day, and a different kind of tired. Because here's the thing, Victorians didn't necessarily sleep like you do. They didn't lie down at 11 p.m. sharp, sleep in a neat block of 8 hours, then wake up to a podcast and protein shake. No, they had something a little more broken, a little more human in a way. It's called segmented sleep. You fall asleep at sunset, or maybe a few hours after, and then wake up around midnight. Not for a minute or two, but for an hour, sometimes 2. They called it the watching hour, a pause in the middle of the night's rest, during which people read, wrote letters, even visited neighbors. Then, with the moon still high, they'd settle back in for a second stretch of slumber before dawn. And now, with that in mind, consider the sleepy afternoon again. If you're already dividing your night into 2 acts, your body starts getting a little cheeky by mid-afternoon. It wants a bonus round, A siesta, a soft little snooze between lunch and whatever grueling nonsense the evening has planned. Historians still argue whether segmented sleep was universal across classes or mostly common in rural or pre-industrial settings, but the cultural residue is there. Even in bustling cities like Manchester or Birmingham, people referenced first sleep and second sleep well into the 1800s. It made naps make more sense. If sleep wasn't one long thing, but rather a series of stints, then why not squeeze in another between two chores? You begin to see napping not as an escape, but as participation, a way to honor the odd little rhythms of your own body. You walk past a townhouse with its shutters drawn. Inside, a gentleman in a waistcoat is perusing the Times. But let's be real, he's holding it just high enough to hide his drifting eyelids. His breathing slows, the paper droops. He's gone. Even medical journals from the period touch on this. A particularly dry and delightfully judgmental article in The Lancet from the 1870s refers to biphasic repose as not uncommon among men of industrious habits. Translation: if you nap, but make it smart, we'll allow it. It wasn't just adults either. Children were expected to nap, or at least lie silently, for large portions of the afternoon. Not because anyone believed in brain development. Oh no. The concern was overstimulation. There was a prevailing fear that too much noise or play would damage a child's nervous system. And so, nap time wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced with military precision. There's a diary entry from a governess who writes, 2 o'clock, boys confined to nursery, silence required, no toys permitted, no rocking permitted, nurse reads aloud scripture until all eyes are closed. A little intense, maybe, but very on brand for a society that thought sugar could cause moral decay. And while we're here, imagine that nursery, wallpapered in faded florals, curtains drawn against the bright sun, a clock ticking like a metronome. Outside, a gardener shuffles past. Inside, a boy pretends to sleep, one eye open just enough to watch dust sparkle in a sunbeam. It's calm, oddly beautiful, and it's not bedtime, it's nap time. Meanwhile, downstairs, the lady of the house is having her own restful interval. Maybe on a chaise, maybe horizontal in the drawing room with a lavender sachet under her chin. The servants know better than to disturb her. Afternoon was the pause, and everyone needed it, even the ones who pretended they didn't. There's a fringe practice worth noting here called drowsing. Not full sleep, not quite meditation, just a kind of soft daze encouraged by warm rooms, repetitive sounds, or long readings of moral tales. It was seen as genteel, especially for women. If you drowsed, you weren't being idle, you were being delicate. And some people took it to the next level. We know from personal letters that there were families who scheduled time specifically for what they called post-luncheon repo. Imagine that on a calendar. 1:30, roast beef. 2 o'clock, dramatic sigh and swoon onto fainting couch. No alarms, no guilt. And yes, there were those who judged. One snippy columnist in an 1882 women's magazine decried the post-noon indulgence of housewives as invitations to moral decay. Harsh. Though coming from a woman who probably never cleaned a coal stove may be a bit rich. The bigger point is, Victorians didn't have a rigid one-size-fits-all approach to sleep. They were just trying to survive the weirdness of their world, a world where electric light wasn't common until well into the 20th century, a world lit by gas, filled with noise, soot, and more physical labor than anyone in yoga pants today can fathom. You were always tired, and everyone else was too. Now picture this, a coastal village in Yorkshire, a fisherman's cottage. Lunch is done. The waves murmur against the shore, and the only clock is the sun. The fisherman props his feet on a low stool, his dog curled by the hearth. His wife sits beside him, knitting forgotten in her lap. Neither speaks, neither moves. The quiet is absolute. It's not called a nap, not exactly, but it's understood. A sacred moment before the rest of the day pulls them apart again. And this slow rhythm wasn't just tradition, it was survival. Without this lull, the body would break down, the mind would fray. There was no caffeine culture, no quick fixes, only time, only softness, only rest. You start to see it now, how all of this set the stage for napping not as rebellion, but as something deeply, almost painfully normal. Even Queen Victoria herself was rumored to enjoy her quiet hours. Though she'd never admit to napping, the palace schedules often had mysterious withdrawals to private chambers just after lunch. Historians still argue whether these were naps, prayer sessions, or simply breaks from the suffocating bustle of royal life. But the timing is suspiciously drowsy. So next time you find yourself fading around 3 p.m., remember, you're not lazy. You're just perfectly Victorian. And as the afternoon light dims behind your imaginary lace-curtained window, you understand something else. The nap is not an escape. It's a rhythm. One the Victorians, for all their rigid rules and uncomfortable chairs, somehow knew better than we do now. You lean back into your own pillow, listening for a gas lamp to sputter, a carriage to roll by, a newspaper to drift gently from slack hands to polished floorboards. And just like that, you nap too. You stir, not from sound exactly, but from a change in the air. The fog outside has shifted. It's thinner now, though still clinging to the windows like a sullen guest refusing to leave. The light has that gauzy lemon-gray quality, the kind that makes everything look tired, including you. But the day presses on. You're still nestled in the Victorian afternoon, where napping isn't just a physical need, it's also fashionably camouflaged. See, no one says nap in polite society. That would sound uncultured, like eating bread straight from the loaf or laughing too loudly in a drawing room. No, here, sleep is artfully disguised with a bouquet of euphemisms. Taking a rest, closing one's eyes, withdrawing, seeking a restorative hour. The words are softer than the pillows themselves. And for those higher up the social ladder, napping becomes even more theatrical. Picture a drawing room in Mayfair, polished wood, tall mirrors, a parlor clock ticking gently in the corner. Lady Everingham reclines, not lies down, mind you, but reclines on a chaise draped in imported velvet. She wears something in pale lilac, probably with lace cuffs, and she is fatigued by correspondence. A maid enters quietly, removes the tea tray, and draws the curtains halfway. Not all the way, that would imply sleep. Just enough for gentle gloom. Lady Everingham tilts her head back and exhales dramatically. You can almost hear the sigh. Her fan slips from her gloved fingers. Eyes close. Mouth relaxes. She is not napping. She is recovering. This delicate performance of fatigue is practically a language in itself. A whole vocabulary of sighs and glances and overpronounced O's to excuse what is really a very necessary human thing, the need to shut down for a bit. Historians still debate whether these rituals were conscious class markers or simply absorbed habits, but the effect is the same. Napping becomes something not just permissible, but elegant, especially for women. The infamous fainting couch? Not actually for fainting most of the time. It was for lounging, for taking one's leisure, which often, unsurprisingly, included dozing off mid-conversation. You just needed to do it while wearing a corset and not smudging your gloves. And there's a curious double standard at play here. While women were encouraged, sometimes even required to rest, men had to be more covert. A gentleman falling asleep in the club's reading room? Understandable. A man dozing off in the office? Scandalous. But, of course, they did it anyway. The gentlemen's clubs of London, places like the Athenaeum, the Reform Club, or White's, were sanctuaries of snore. After lunch, after port, after the Times, you can guess what happened. Heads tilted, papers drooped, waistcoats stretched slightly as breath deepened. One traveler noted in a letter, By 2:30, the reading room hums with the soft chorus of dreams. No one commented, no one teased. It was simply understood. Between the hours of 2 and 4, these titans of industry became toddlers with top hats. And honestly, respect. Meanwhile, in middle-class households, the situation was more practical. Imagine Mrs. Lockwood, wife of a railway clerk, mother of 4, orchestrator of everything. It's 3:10 p.m. She'd has just boiled another kettle. The mending pile glares at her. The baby is, thank heaven, asleep. The older children are outside failing to build something useful. And she's alone in the parlor. She sits. She folds her hands neatly over her apron. She stares into the fire for a long time. Then, head nods forward. Just for 5 minutes, maybe 10. She won't call it a nap, but you and I know better. The real wonder of the Victorian nap isn't that it existed, but that it found such clever ways to hide in plain sight. It wasn't a scheduled rest. There were no alarms, no apps, no official nap pods with lumbar support. There was just life, and the rare, stolen quiet within it. And sometimes the nap wasn't stolen, it was enforced. Hospitals, for instance, had very strict schedules that included afternoon quiet hours. Not necessarily for patients, though they did benefit, but for nurses and staff too. One matron's notes from a London infirmary in 1874 mention rest intervals in shifts, where even the busiest staff were encouraged to sit in a darkened room and reflect. Reflect, in this case, being code for collapsing into sleep while holding a clipboard. Prisons, oddly enough, had similar rhythms. Inmates, particularly in debtors' prisons or workhouses, were given long midday pauses. Not out of kindness, oh no, but because tired workers are inefficient workers. Letting someone nap between rock-breaking sessions was simply good management. And then the railways. Picture it. You're a station master in rural Wales. Trains come and go, but mostly they don't. You've waved your little flag, you've checked your ledger, you've locked the gate. And now you nap. Upright, in a stiff chair. Hat tipped over your face like a cowboy in a Dickens novel. It's not glamorous, but it works. There's even anecdotal evidence of train guards who synchronized their afternoon breaks with scheduled lulls in service, curling up on benches between passenger waves. A blink here, a nod there. If you've ever seen someone nap in an airport gate chair, you get the vibe. What's fascinating is how sleep, this completely universal biological process, was so tightly choreographed by social class, architecture, and etiquette. You napped differently depending on what kind of chair you owned, what kind of job you worked, and what kind of neighbors might be watching. Even the design of the furniture said something. The overstuffed armchair with the winged sides? That wasn't just for warmth. It helped hold your head upright when you drifted off. The daybed in parlors? Not a bed, not a couch, but exactly what it said it was. A sly Victorian invention for horizontal denial. And let's not forget the curious little nap accessories. Smelling salts weren't always for reviving the fainted. They were also for sharpening you back into wakefulness after you rested your eyes. Some ladies kept cooling pads infused with rose water to press against their temples when they roused. Some men swore by damp handkerchiefs or mint lozenges. Everyone had a trick. There's a fringe anecdote of a schoolmaster in Surrey who encouraged his older students to take a 5-minute mental pause with eyes closed after lunch. He called it internal scholarship. The students called it nap club. You can guess who had more fun. The cultural obsession with productivity wasn't quite what it is today. Yes, Victorians worked hard, but they also deeply respected stillness. Quiet moments weren't laziness. They were refinement, cultivation, proof that you weren't scrambling, that you had, if only for an hour, enough. You lean back now, just slightly, and imagine what your Victorian nap might look like. Maybe you're a governess, finally alone in the library with a faint smell of lemon polish in the air. Maybe you're a lamplighter who's done for the day before the evening walk begins. Maybe you're a bookseller with no customers at 2:45 on a drizzly Tuesday. Or maybe you're just tired. And here, in this soft hush between afternoon and evening, you remember that even in a century built on etiquette and industry, people still closed their eyes, still let go, still drifted, just like you are now. The shadows in the room grow longer now, though you hardly notice them stretching. They creep gently along the baseboards like old friends arriving for tea, uninvited but entirely expected. You remain where you are, lulled by the slow unraveling of time, and still thoroughly embedded in the quiet cadence of the Victorian afternoon. But now you're starting to wonder, was this sleepy lifestyle just a personal choice, a cultural quirk, or was it something more medical? Welcome to the era of the rest cure, the strange, padded bedrock of how Victorians handled, well, basically anything slightly inconvenient involving nerves, women, or emotions. You see, in the 19th century, rest wasn't just a luxury, it was medicine, prescribed, measured, and enforced. Not the fun, cozy kind of rest either. We're talking weeks, sometimes months of enforced horizontal life, all in the name of calming the system. It started innocently enough. Doctors began to notice that some patients, especially women, complained of nervous disorders, fatigue, fainting, anxiety, lack of appetite. You know, the kind of symptoms that today would be gently met with therapy or a vitamin B12 shot. Back then, the cure was to do absolutely nothing. No reading, no writing, no talking, certainly no laughing. Just lie there for weeks. Historians still argue whether the rest cure was a misogynistic control tactic or a genuine, if deeply misguided, attempt at care. Probably both. It was famously devised by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, who believed that too much mental activity, particularly for women, could be dangerous. The brain, he insisted, needed silence to heal. So, if you were unlucky enough to be diagnosed with neurasthenia or female hysteria, terms as vague as they are insulting, you were swiftly assigned a regimen of solitude, warm milk, and long naps in darkened rooms. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the writer of The Yellow Wallpaper, underwent this treatment and later wrote a story about being driven slowly mad by it. Spoiler alert, not every nap ends well. Still, outside the asylum walls and away from doctors with questionable mustaches, rest had gentler applications. If you were wealthy and well-connected, you could go to a sanatorium in the country, a kind of sleepy, overgrown health spa where the birds chirped, the broths were tepid, and the napping was taken very, very seriously. Patients weren't allowed to exert themselves. No climbing stairs, no reading the newspaper if it contained upsetting news, and certainly no conversation after tea. You were there to nap your way back to moral and physical balance, and perhaps knit something very slowly while gazing out a window. Even for those not actively ill, the threat of nervous collapse loomed large enough to justify preventive rest. If you were feeling run down, low-spirited, or peevish, it was time to lie on the fainting couch, sip barley water, and pretend not to hear your children screaming upstairs. And yes, this applied mainly to women, but not exclusively. Men, too, suffered from overexertion of the faculties, particularly clergymen, civil servants, and teachers. For them, the prescription was often a country holiday, or, more excitingly, a complete removal to the seaside. That's right, if you were burned out, the Victorian solution was literally, go lie down near waves. Genius. Imagine this. A boarding house in Brighton. You, pale and exhausted from too much penmanship and moral instruction, are wrapped in a travel rug on a striped deck chair. The sea mist cools your cheeks. Someone hands you a warm, bland pudding. A doctor with a monocle declares, "You shall improve through quietude." You fall asleep before the sentence finishes. Not a bad gig, really. The fringe side of this culture? Rest became performance. A way to show that you could afford to be still. Leisure was luxury. So some people leaned in hard. There were ladies who ordered fainting couches upholstered in ice blue velvet and positioned them directly under portrait windows to nap in the filtered light. Men who insisted on post-lunch meditative interludes behind closed office doors, surrounded by cigar smoke and ticking clocks. One lord reportedly had a custom resting robe stitched from Irish linen and wore it only between 2 and 3:15 p.m. when he reclined in a private solarium. That's commitment. And it wasn't just about health, it was about optics. To rest was to appear fragile, but tastefully so. Fragility was fashionable, especially if it came with good curtains. Of course, this didn't apply to the working poor. For the vast majority of Victorians, rest was not prescribed, it was stolen. Snatched in alleys, in back rooms, in tenement stairwells, on lunch crates, and between knitting needles. Factory workers didn't get nap breaks. Domestic servants didn't get quiet hours. Their fatigue was assumed, ignored, and woven into the background hum of city life. But that doesn't mean they didn't nap. There's evidence, letters, stories, household logs, that maids would sometimes doze for 5 minutes in linen closets, heads resting on folded sheets. Dock workers would lean back on bags of grain for 20 blessed minutes before the whistle blew. One boy wrote home from his first year in service to say, "I find I can nap sitting up if I keep a rag over my eyes. They think I am polishing shoes." Beautiful, sad, completely understandable. In one fringe case, a household in Leeds was documented as having a rule for their butler. He was to sleep exactly 20 minutes after lunch in the scullery, with a hot brick wrapped in flannel placed against his chest. The brick was removed precisely at the 20-minute mark, possibly the world's earliest power nap alarm. And this isn't just anecdotal fluff. Some early medical thinkers did start to recognize the value of rest for everyone, not just the fainting elite. One Dr. Eliza Russell, a rare female physician of the era, wrote that the brief withdrawal of the mind from duties of strain could be beneficial for both mother and minor. Radical, ahead of her time, possibly ignored by everyone. The more you think about it, the more Victorian life starts to look like a balancing act between visible busyness and invisible burnout. The society kept chugging forward, steam-powered, soot-covered, but underneath it all was this constant undercurrent of exhaustion, emotional, physical, existential. So yes, napping wasn't just about sleep. It was rebellion in some cases, survival in others, a doctor's order, a desperate plea, a way of dealing with the absurdity of corsets, coal fires, and 12-hour shifts. Even the literature reflects it. In Dickens, people fall asleep constantly. Mr. Pickwick naps. Mrs. Jellyby dozes mid-sentence. Pip, in Great Expectations, falls into a kind of weary trance more than once. And it's never questioned, because of course they nap. Who wouldn't? And perhaps, like you, they're never quite sure whether they chose to nap, or if the day simply crept in and pulled them gently under. Which, speaking of, you're still here, still wrapped in that imaginary travel rug. The sea might not be real, but the hush is. And somewhere in your Victorian brain, a faint bell chimes for tea. But no one rises. Not yet. Because rest isn't wasted time. It's a place, and for now, you live there. The fireplace sputters gently, its last coals glowing with the reluctant warmth of an evening that still doesn't quite know what to do with itself. You don't move. You don't need to. The air feels heavier now, not in a pressing way, but in that particular Victorian way that makes everything seem draped in velvet and whisper quiet etiquette. You feel as though you've become part of the furniture, which, frankly, is exactly the kind of ambition a good Victorian nap might encourage. Let's sink deeper. By now, you've wandered through a few drawing rooms, sniffed out the fainting couches, heard the doctors with their rest cures and their extremely unhelpful mustaches. But now, we arrive at something more communal, more rhythmic. A nap not as escape or recovery, but as routine. Let's talk about the daily dance of rest across an entire household. Because Victorian homes, especially the well-to-do ones, ran like clockwork. Creaky, candlelit, overly ornate clockwork. And nestled inside that mechanical ballet were pockets of sanctioned, even sacred stillness. You didn't just nap when you were tired, you napped because the bell said so. Everything in a grand Victorian household was run by bells. Pull cords, wall dials, a hierarchy of dings and chimes that told servants when to deliver tea, when to open the drapes, when to fetch the cat, and, yes, when to withdraw. Withdrawal was the polite term for when the household collectively agreed to pretend nothing urgent was happening and everyone simply vanished into their own private little silences. Usually in the late afternoon, between the second post and dinner preparations. Mistress of the house retired to her chambers. Master of the house, sitting room, cigar barely lit, newspaper unread, eyelids, well, negotiating. Children shipped off to the nursery or bundled into perambulators for their own resting time. And the servants? Oh, the servants didn't nap, of course not. Except they did. Historians still argue whether unofficial servant rest was tolerated, ignored, or forbidden. But one fringe detail from a Scottish Manners 1879 servant log lists a 30-minute drawing room break for the second housemaid, who otherwise worked 14 hours a day. She used it to lie on a folded coat in the attic and, according to her own marginal note, dream of nothing. Beautiful. Because you see, even the most industrious of Victorians had to obey the logic of their own bodies. No one could keep up that much starch and structure without, at some point, collapsing into a chair with a sigh. You know the sigh, the one you make when no one's watching. And as houses grew more complex, so did the dance of rest. In London townhouses, for instance, naps had to be carefully slotted between deliveries, dusting rounds, and the ladies' fittings. A butler might allow himself precisely 11 minutes of repose in the wine cellar while checking corks. A nanny might nap with one hand still on the cradle. Not ideal, but efficient. Even the houses themselves conspired to help. Think about the architecture. Thick walls, heavy drapes, inner rooms with no exterior windows, parlors and boudoirs designed to be dark and cool in the summer and cozy and hushed in the winter. Victorians built homes that invited withdrawal. It wasn't laziness, it was good design. You didn't just have a guest room, you had a morning room, an afternoon room, and, if you were really fancy, a withdrawing room. A space quite literally named for the art of stepping back. That's how seriously they took it. And it wasn't just in homes. Nap rhythms played out across public life, too. In theaters, between matinees and evening performances, there was a curious lull. Actors, many of them exhausted from wearing 14 layers and projecting in falsetto, would collapse in corners of dressing rooms. One actor wrote in his memoirs that the costume of King Lear makes a fine pillow when inverted. Practical and tragic. In Parliament, sessions often broke for refreshment, which sounds like lemonade, but frequently translated to a stiff drink and 20 minutes with one's eyes closed in the members' lounge. Reports suggest more than one debate began with a yawn, ended with someone gently snoring behind a copy of the Times. Even Queen Victoria herself, yeah.
Take the schoolroom, for example. Little boys in waistcoats, girls in lace-trimmed pinafores, all seated on wooden benches, meant for penmanship, not comfort. Lessons droned on, the fire hissed, and slowly, heads bobbed like sleepy sunflowers. Teachers did not appreciate this. One stern tutor from Manchester wrote, "I permit no languor. Languor is decay." Which sounds dramatic until you realize his classroom had no windows and lessons started at 7 a.m. Still, children did nap, especially the youngest ones. Nurseries had rest periods after midday meals. Often this meant a room with drawn shades, a ticking clock, and a nursemaid reading some deeply boring moral tale aloud until everyone, including herself, had drifted into slumber. Or possibly despair. Some fringe households even experimented with scheduled sleep training for toddlers, long before baby books made it trendy. One mother wrote in her journal, "Between 3 and 5, the household grows still. Even the dog understands. Honestly, give that dog a nap mat and a biscuit." But the real champions of routine repose? Railway clerks. Yes, the unsung heroes of timetables and polite yawns. In cities and countryside alike, these modest men upheld the ticking spine of the nation. They logged departures, signaled arrivals, and, when no one was looking, dozed behind tall ledgers. A well-known clerk's trick was the ink blot nap. You place your elbow near the inkwell, lean your head on your hand, and if someone calls your name, you rouse with a grunt and wave vaguely at a form. The ink blot? That's just creative evidence of industry. Then there were the shopkeepers. Not the grand ones with 10 assistants, but the humble tobacconist, the bookseller, the woman who sold ribbons and hatpins. Between the lunch rush and the dinner scramble, there was a lull. The door didn't open. The gas lamps hummed. You, the keeper of goods, leaned on the counter and gave in, just for a bit. Customers understood. In fact, many joined in. A letter from 1886 describes a general store in Dorset, where the shopkeeper and 2 customers all nodded off for 12 minutes during a thunderstorm. "We woke together," the letter says, and no one mentioned it. A perfect pause. A perfect pause. That's what naps really were. Not indulgent, not frivolous, just pauses. Little pockets of stillness in an age of constant expectation. And maybe, just maybe, that's why they were treasured. Because when everything around you is moving, carriages rattling down cobblestones, trains screeching into stations, tea being poured precisely at 4, it takes something deeply human to stop, to fold your arms, to close your eyes, to exhale like it's the only thing you're responsible for. So now, in your quiet place, surrounded by shadows that know your name, you feel that pause stretching longer. You are not alone. You are one of many. Maids, lords, clerks, children, queens, all connected by this gentle rebellion against the ticking world. Let it keep ticking. You're busy doing nothing. You're still drifting there, in that soft hinged space between yesterday and not quite now. You haven't moved, and yet the scene has changed. The clink of teacups has faded, replaced by the slower, quieter rhythm of home. And not just any home, a Victorian home, with its thick velvet drapes, patterned wallpapers, and an overwhelming number of doilies per square foot. By now, you've probably guessed that naps in this era weren't just a matter of tired people lying down. No, this is the Victorians we're talking about. Everything had rules, especially how, when, and where you were allowed to rest. And those rules were never stricter than inside the home. Because Victorian households were little theaters of morality and routine. Everything from the arrangement of furniture to the timing of meals was part of an intricate social performance. And in this grand domestic opera, even a nap had its cue. Let's set the stage. You live in a respectable middle-class Victorian home. Your parlor is tidy. Your carpets are, dear heavens, patterned. And somewhere, buried in your weekly schedule between elevenses and dinner, is a sacred, silent window called rest hour. This wasn't some spontaneous stretch-out-on-the-couch event. No, rest was timetabled and choreographed, especially if you were a lady. Afternoon rest, usually between 2 and 4 p.m., was considered a vital part of household health, not just for you, but for everyone under your roof. Children were sent to their rooms. Husbands were encouraged to stay at the office. Servants knew to be silent. If you were of the proper class, you were expected to repose. That could mean reclining on a fainting couch, reading something morally improving, or simply sitting still and daydreaming by a lace-curtained window. And yes, you were expected to look elegant while doing it. Crumpling your skirts was a scandalous waste of fabric. These habits weren't just aesthetic, they were psychological. Rest hour was a buffer between the formal public day and the intimate domestic evening. You used it to shed the expectations of society, quietly unbutton your bodice, just one hook, don't be wild, and transition into the slower rhythms of private life. Quirky aside, some Victorian advice books actually gave detailed instructions on how to nap correctly. One suggested you lie with your face angled precisely 20 degrees toward the nearest light source, so as to preserve your complexion while still resting the eyes. Another warned against sleeping with your mouth open, lest you attract dust, or worse, judgment. And this wasn't limited to women. Men, too, had their version of the domestic nap, often after lunch, in the study, with a copy of the Times folded neatly over their chest and a pipe cooling nearby. There's a long-standing trope in Victorian literature of the weary patriarch resting his eyes after luncheon while his wife quietly embroiders a cushion the size of a battleship. It wasn't just a cliché. It was routine.
The furniture even tells the story. Fainting couches, daybeds, window seats with built-in head bolsters, these weren't decorative flourishes, they were tools. Entire rooms were around the idea that, at some point in the afternoon, you might need to gracefully pass out. And let's talk about those fainting couches for a second, because they're not just delightfully dramatic, they actually served a purpose, sort of. Victorian fashion, you'll recall, was not exactly breathable. Corsets were stiff, skirts were voluminous, and under all those layers, you were basically slow cooking. So yes, women often did faint, from heat, from compression, from sheer theatrical flair. But many used fainting as a sanctioned break, a way to reclaim a moment of stillness without admitting fatigue. Because in polite society, being weary might seem lazy, but having a delicate constitution, that was practically chic. Historians still debate whether these practices were forms of silent rebellion, little subversions in a world obsessed with decorum, or if they were just another layer of control disguised as etiquette. Likely both. But the result is the same. The Victorian home became a resting place, not just in practice, but in ideology, a quiet temple of ordered stillness. Even children weren't spared. Rest hour for young Victorians was strictly enforced. You didn't have to sleep, but you did have to lie quietly. No talking, no fidgeting, just contemplate your own tiny existence under a crocheted blanket while staring at a wallpaper pattern that hasn't changed since Napoleon. Some children, of course, found clever ways around this. One boy reportedly trained himself to sleep with one eye slightly open so he could keep watch for the nanny's return. Another stuffed a pillow under his blanket and snuck out to spy on the family's piano tuner. Victorian mischief, subtle, silent, and heavily buttoned. And then there were the rules for servants. Rest for the help was not exactly encouraged. Most domestic workers labored from dawn until long after dinner. But even they, in rare moments, found space to nap. A scullery maid might doze off while shelling peas in the larder. A footman might lean against the coal chute for 10 luxurious minutes of stillness while pretending to inspect a hinge. In fact, some households unofficially allowed junior staff to rest during downtime, typically mid-afternoon, between cleaning up lunch and preparing tea. But it was an unspoken agreement. You rested only if your work was done, and you were never, ever caught lying down. One butler's manual from 1878 actually warned, "The appearance of idleness must be avoided.
even if it is rest in fact. A true servant appears ever engaged, even when at peace. Translation: you may nap, but only if you look like you're polishing something while doing it. This dance between actual rest and the appearance of productivity says everything about Victorian domestic culture. You could rest, you should rest, but only in the proper form, at the proper time, and ideally while wearing something with embroidery. The irony, of course, is that this deeply formalized version of rest often resulted in the exact opposite: stress. So many rules, so many postures, so much performance. Yet still, underneath all that constraint, people found their own ways to rest. Some ignored the rules completely. There are letters, private ones, where women write to friends admitting they sneak extra naps in the nursery after the children fall asleep. One described lying on the floor behind a chase lounge so no one would see her collapse ungracefully. And of course, the true subversives of the era, the artists, the poets, the professional loafers, embraced naps as lifestyle. Oscar Wilde once claimed he got his best ideas half asleep under a tree. And if that doesn't make you want to immediately lie down under a tree in a velvet jacket, I don't know what will. Even Queen Victoria herself was known to enjoy repose in the afternoons. She often wrote in her journal about taking rest in my boudoir, or having a quiet half hour with her dogs after lunch. Naturally, she made it sound terribly noble. But let's be real, queen or not, she was taking a royal nap. And so, as you sit there now, slowly reclining in your imaginary Victorian home, the lamps dimmed and the parlor clock ticking faintly, you begin to understand. The nap was never just about rest. It was about control, about class, about carving out a moment, however small, where you could be still in a world constantly demanding performance. In that quiet, you hear the hush of an entire culture trying, in its own rigid way, to pause, to breathe, to close its heavily lashed eyes.
You're still lying there, tucked under an imaginary crocheted afghan, the gentle ticking of a long case clock echoing down the hallway. The curtains are drawn. Somewhere a floorboard creaks, but no one comes. The house, like your mind, is slipping into stillness. And now, the hush of Victorian afternoons takes on a deeper, almost medical shade. Because for all their obsession with etiquette, the Victorians were even more obsessed with health. They were constantly diagnosing themselves, fretting over digestion, circulation, nervous energy, humors, and an impressive number of ailments you've never heard of. And into that frilly, fainting world, naps found a whole new identity, as a prescription. It wasn't laziness, you see. It was therapeutic, medically justified, doctor-approved downtime. And that made all the difference. For the Victorians, the nap wasn't just a break. It was often a treatment, especially for what they called nervous complaints. These weren't always specific. Nervous exhaustion could cover anything, from chronic anxiety to burnout, depression, grief, or just plain overstimulation from too many parlor visits. And who, I ask you, hasn't been overstimulated by parlor visits? Doctors prescribed rest like candy, especially for women. The most famous example, of course, was the rest cure. If your nerves were frayed, your emotions unstable, or your imagination just a touch too vivid, a physician might recommend the full course: total isolation, weeks in bed, no reading, no writing, no talking, just food, massages, and sleep. Sounds relaxing, right? It wasn't. The rest cure was invented by American neurologist Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s and quickly took off in Britain. It was mostly imposed on upper-class women, artists, thinkers, anyone too sensitive for the rough-and-tumble world of Victorian industry. The theory was that overstimulation was causing a depletion of nervous energy. The solution? Bed rest, and plenty of it. But this wasn't the cozy nap-when-you-feel-like-it kind of rest. It was enforced stillness. No visitors, no creative outlets.
You were expected to lie there day after day in silence while being spoon-fed milk and whispered vague reassurances. Imagine trying to recover from anxiety while being treated like an antique vase on a shelf. Historians still argue whether this cure helped or harmed more people. Some women claimed it saved them. Others, like author Charlotte Perkins Gilman, were driven nearly mad by it. She famously wrote The Yellow Wallpaper as a furious, symbolic protest. That story, yeah, that wasn't fiction. That was memoir with metaphors. But not all naps were so extreme. Victorian physicians also promoted milder forms of rest, recumbent pauses, as one charmingly put it. These short periods of lying down, typically mid-afternoon, were seen as a way to reset the body's internal balance, especially for those recovering from illness, mourning, or even a heavy meal. In fact, one health manual from 1883 suggests taking 30 minutes horizontal daily after luncheon to encourage digestive serenity and restore mental composure. Sounds fancy, but basically it's the Victorian version of saying, lie down, let the roast beef settle, and maybe stop panicking about your nephew's engagement.
For invalids, those long-term sick, injured, or convalescent, the nap was an anchor. Victorian homes often had entire sick rooms dedicated to rest. These were carefully arranged spaces with low lighting, thick curtains, trays of broths, and stacks of gently improving literature. The idea was that the environment itself would lull the patient into healing. And sometimes it wasn't just physical healing. The Victorians believed that mental states could be soothed through sleep. Anxiety, heartbreak, melancholy, they were all thought to respond to quiet, controlled napping. One particularly poetic doctor wrote that sleep permits the soul to forget what the heart cannot. You have to give it to them. They knew how to write a prescription with flair. Still, Victorian doctors weren't always gentle. There was an undercurrent of moral judgment in much of their advice. Fatigue wasn't just a symptom, it could also be a character flaw. Too much sleep meant you were idle. Too little meant you were reckless. You had to nap just right. Like Goldilocks, but with more corsets. And, of course, gender mattered. Women were encouraged to nap, often excessively, because too much stimulation was seen as dangerous. Men, on the other hand, were supposed to nap just enough to keep up productivity. Rest was for refueling, not reflection. There's even a hilarious account of a man who was advised by his doctor to take a short daily nap to calm his nerves, only to be ridiculed by his friends for being unmanly. He tried to disguise his naps as afternoon business meetings. Frankly, we applaud the creativity. Still, doctors weren't entirely wrong about the importance of rest. Many Victorian ailments, like neurasthenia, a catch-all for fatigue, anxiety, and general funk, were likely just fancy names for what we now call burnout. And naps do help with that. The body needs sleep. The mind needs quiet. Even back then, they knew that. Quirky detail? One 19th-century sanatorium reportedly built nap gardens where patients could recline on padded benches under trees, attended by nurses in pristine white. They even piped in harp music. The vibe was somewhere between spa retreat and extremely well-funded nap cult. These gardens weren't just for the rich either. Some city hospitals created sleeping wards where overworked clerks, typists, and postal workers could recover from exhaustion. It was a recognition that modern life, even in its steampunk infancy, was grinding people down. Sleep then became something sacred, prescribed, protected, ritualized. And while it sounds charming on the surface, there was also fear behind it. Victorian medicine was full of dread. Fear of degeneration, of madness, of what happens when the mind refuses to quiet. They believed sleep could save you from the brink, that if you just lay still long enough, your mind would return to its proper setting. And maybe they weren't wrong. Because even now, in your own quiet moment, you can feel the truth behind it. The mind softens when the body is still.
The panic fades. The thrum of the world dims. All those frilly, overstuffed parlors may have been ridiculous, but the act of lying down, closing your eyes, and giving your body permission to pause, that's timeless. And so you picture it now. The quiet patient in the sick room with gauzy curtains and a gently ticking clock. The woman lying on a chaise with a silk eye mask and a book she's not really reading. The anxious clerk resting in a hospital cot, clutching a note from his supervisor saying, "Doctor's orders." They are all doing the same thing you are, seeking peace, one nap at a time.
Still nestled in the hush of that old-world quiet, your thoughts now drift beyond drawing rooms and fainting couches. Through the sleepy haze of domestic afternoons and rest cure regimens, a new space beckons. Somewhere larger, grander, and significantly louder, the Victorian city. Because while private homes were temples of naptime ritual, the bustling streets outside weren't exactly whisper quiet. In fact, they were chaos in tweed. And yet, even here, among coal dust and clattering hoofbeats, people still found ways to nap, or at least to pause. You step into a street in London, circa 1885. The air smells like soot and overcooked onions. Horses clip past. A newspaper boy yells something indecipherable. And yet, just off the curb, a cab driver slumps back in his hansom, reins loosely in hand, eyes closed. Is he napping or dead? Nope, just napping. Sort of. Because in the noisy machinery of Victorian cities, rest looked very different. It was public, impromptu, and often purely practical. There wasn't time for etiquette here. If you needed to rest, you did it wherever you could. And for many working-class Victorians, that meant catching a few moments of unconsciousness between shifts, on benches, in stairwells, or even standing upright. That's right, some jobs required you to nap on your feet. Factory workers, dock hands, street sweepers. They didn't have the luxury of sick rooms and chaise lounges, but they still got tired. So they found micro moments of stillness between bell rings, deliveries, or train whistles. Historians still argue whether this kind of public napping should be seen as resilience or desperation. Maybe both. For many, it was all they had. After all, Victorian workdays were brutal. 14-hour shifts were common. Child labor was everywhere. And Sundays, the only day off for most, were supposed to be used for church and quiet reflection, not catching up on sleep. So you worked, and you napped when and where you could. One dock worker wrote in a letter that he and his mates used to lie down in grain sacks during lunch breaks, the dust making them sneeze, but better than no rest at all. Another, a chimney sweep, claimed he could nap standing with his head against a wall, though not for more than 10 minutes, or you'd get soot in your teeth. Even London cabbies had their own version of nap time. At certain cab stands, drivers would queue up, tip their hats forward over their eyes, and doze until a passenger rapped the side of the carriage. Some had specially padded seats just for this purpose. Comfort wasn't the goal, survival was. But it wasn't just the laborers. Clerks, typists, and even shop girls had their own rituals. A shop assistant might sneak behind a curtain during a lull in foot traffic. A bank clerk could pretend to be tallying ledgers while quietly nodding off over the inkpot. The trick was timing and making sure your boss thought you were still industrious, or at least upright. Quirky aside, a few enterprising Londoners even tried to turn naps into business. Enter the sleep chair. Around the 1890s, a man named Ambrose Godwin opened a tiny storefront in the East End that offered 10 minutes nap in peace and clean surroundings for a penny. Inside, you'd find a row of padded armchairs, a screen to block street noise, and strict instructions not to snore. It was wildly popular with shift workers and delivery boys. A competing business opened the following year called the Gentleman's Pause, which advertised itself as London's premier sleep parlor. This one had clocks on the wall, footstools,
and a selection of soothing tonic cordials, which were probably just brandy in fancy bottles. They didn't last, of course. The concept was too strange, too ahead of its time. But for a brief, glorious moment, public naps were stylish. And as cities got bigger, so did the need for rest. Victorian urban life was exhausting. Pollution, noise, overcrowding, it wore you down. So reformers started to note. By the 1890s, a few charitable organizations began setting up restrooms for workers, places where overworked nurses or delivery boys could sit quietly for a while. These weren't fancy, just chairs, maybe a teapot, and some dim light. But they were the start of something, a recognition that humans aren't machines. One London reformer even proposed nap breaks in factories. It didn't catch on. Management argued that tired workers should simply eat more beef, which, bold strategy, not particularly helpful. But even without formal rest spaces, the culture began to shift. Newspapers started publishing articles about the dangers of overwork. Mental overstrain became a popular phrase, especially among middle-class readers who worried their telegram writing jobs were frying their brains. One 1897 article advised city dwellers to take 5-minute reposes between engagements and to avoid too many stimulating conversations. Yes, you heard that right. Too much chat could tire you out. Honestly, same. And amidst all this, the Victorian nap, scrappy, sneaky, half-conscious, persisted. It was the last shred of humanity in a world that seemed to value coal and schedules more than people, the quiet rebellion of shutting your eyes in the middle of a moving city. Even children found ways to rest. In schools, the youngest students often had quiet time in the afternoon, though this varied wildly depending on the teacher. One school in Leeds had the children lie down on rolled-up coats and listen to nature poetry. Another made them stand in silence for 10 minutes while staring at a picture of Queen Victoria. Inspirational? Jury's still out. And then there were the city parks. Hyde Park, Regent's Park, green pockets scattered across the industrial sprawl. For many Victorians, these spaces weren't just for strolling. They were for recovering. Nannies would push prams under shady trees and sneak a 10-minute nap on the bench. Elderly men would tip their hats forward and snore while pretending to feed birds. Even lovers in their tightly corseted courtships might lean back against a tree and share a moment of drowsy, illicit stillness. There's something beautifully democratic about that image. Everyone, from bootblack to banker, closing their eyes under the same sky. Of course, not everyone approved. Letters to the editor poured in, complaining about loiterers in public parks and the indolent poor reclining disgracefully on government benches. Some people just really hated the idea of other people resting. But the nap couldn't be stopped. It slipped between the cracks of Victorian rigidity. It unfolded silently, in corners, on crates, behind curtains. It was unspoken, unpaid, and utterly human. So now, as you imagine yourself there, sitting quietly on a London bench, watching fog gather over the Thames, you understand the secret truth of it all. Even in the loudest, busiest, hardest-edged parts of life, rest insists on its place. You don't need velvet or lace. You don't need a doctor's note or a chaise lounge. You just need to close your eyes. For a minute, for 10, for however long the moment will allow. Because that's what the nap has always been. A quiet no to a world full of yeses. A brief refusal. A reset. And you, time traveler of the imagination, are in excellent company.
The city air lingers like coal dust in your lungs, and as you exhale slowly into that Victorian fog, you begin to float back indoors again, drawn now not to grand parlors or bustling factory floors, but to quieter corners. Private, peculiar spaces. The bedroom, yes, but also the fainting room. That's right. Tonight we're reclining our way straight into the most misunderstood of all Victorian nap zones, the mysterious, velvet-heavy fainting room.
Now, you've probably heard the clichés. Victorian women swooning left and right, gasping for air, collapsing into divans with all the theatrical flair of a Regency drama queen. And yes, there's some truth to that, but it wasn't just the corsets or the drama. It was also architecture, gender politics, and very tired people pretending they were just fine. The fainting room, also called the withdrawing room, or sometimes the ladies' rest, was a small, secluded space in upper-middle-class homes, usually on the first floor, just off the main hall. It was furnished with a daybed or chaise longue, thick curtains, a water pitcher, and an air of genteel exhaustion. And its primary purpose? Retreat. This wasn't a bedroom, heavens no. You wouldn't sleep there, at least not officially. You would withdraw. You'd be feeling delicate, or lightheaded, or perhaps, classic Victorian understatement, in need of repose. It was code, really. A soft, polite way to say, I can't keep pretending to be functional right now. You see, Victorian society was built on relentless appearances. Everyone had a role to play. Women, especially, were expected to be composed, decorative, emotionally restrained, yet perpetually available to others. And all that silent pressure had to go somewhere. So, when it cracked, when the anxiety, boredom, or just sheer fatigue finally tipped the balance, there was always the fainting room. Here's a fringe theory. Some historians suggest these fainting spells were often not medical events at all, but socially sanctioned shutdowns. In a culture that forbade direct expression of stress or sadness, fainting became a loophole. You couldn't admit you were overwhelmed, but you could pass out discreetly into a pillow, then spend an hour alone in a room that was basically made for unspoken breakdowns. Corsets played a role, sure. Some were ludicrously tight. And yes, they could restrict breathing and circulation, especially in warm drawing rooms or during summer garden parties. But not every woman was keeling over because of whalebone and lace. Sometimes it was the sheer weight of existing within a corseted life. And fainting rooms weren't just decorative, they were a legitimate part of home design. Etiquette manuals and home architecture guides from the period mention them explicitly. A small retreat for the lady of the house, where she may refresh herself in moments of strain. That's the fancy version of, I need to lie down and not answer anyone's questions for an hour. And no, before you ask, there was no equivalent space for men. Men had smoking rooms, billiards rooms, libraries, places where they could talk about stocks and cigars while yelling about colonial trade routes. If they felt overwhelmed, they were expected to hide it behind a brandy and a mustache.
So women got the fainting room, a strange little pocket of freedom framed in silk and silence. Now, here's where things get even more interesting. Many fainting rooms had no lock. The door was kept ajar or with only a sheer curtain. Why? Well, this created plausible deniability. If someone fainted, they could be attended to quickly. But more often, it meant people could rest without formally retiring from society. They weren't napping. They were briefly indisposed, entirely different. Remember that Victorian obsession with appearances? The fainting room was a paradox. Public privacy, socially acceptable solitude. One etiquette writer even noted that a hostess may graciously faint once per season without sacrificing her reputation, provided she recovers with good humor and thanks those in attendance, which is, wow, a very generous nap policy. Of course, not every household had the means for a dedicated fainting room, but the idea filtered down. Even modest homes might set aside a corner in the parlor with a smaller couch and a fan, unofficially dubbed the rest nook. It didn't have the glamour, but it served the same purpose, a pause, a soft escape. Historians still argue whether fainting rooms represented repression or a kind of resistance. Were they a symptom of suffocating domestic roles or a clever adaptation? Maybe both. Maybe they were quietly radical in their own sleepy way. Because for all the social rules and soft lighting, these rooms were places where women could be unobserved, unguarded. A Victorian woman couldn't say, "I'm too overwhelmed to entertain," but she could whisper, "I feel faint," and be gently ushered into solitude. Quirky tidbit? Some fainting rooms included bells or special fans to signal when the lady was recovered and ready to rejoin company, like a spa day with a tiny concierge. One American heiress had a button that played soft piano music from the next room to help waft her back to wakefulness. Iconic behavior. And occasionally, women did more than just lie quietly. Letters and diaries hint that fainting rooms were often the only place a woman could read or write without interruption. Some scribbled poems, others penned letters, or even kept secret journals. One widow, recovering from the shock of losing her husband and perhaps gaining some freedom, wrote, "In that small velvet room, I found more truth in a half hour than in 5 years of marriage." So yes, you can call it a nap, but in reality, this was a liminal space, a cocoon, somewhere between duty and dreaming. And you, in this moment, are in your own fainting room. No velvet, no corset, just the quiet reassurance that you too can step away, that it's okay to disappear for a little while. Not because you fainted, not because you're weak, but because you're human. And sometimes being human means saying, "I need a break." So picture it now. Plush cushions, embroidered curtains, the faint scent of lavender sachets, a ticking clock, a tray with a half-drunk glass of water, the quiet knowledge that no one expects anything from you, at least for now. You lie back, close your eyes, and let the room hold you, just as it held so many before.
You stay reclined in that fainting room a little longer, swaddled in hush and florals, until your mind begins to drift once again, this time not toward space, but toward time. Because while you've been so immersed in Victorian life, something quietly remarkable has been unfolding beneath the surface of this entire era, the science of sleep itself. Yes, even as carriages clattered, corsets cinched, and society fainted into tufted furniture, the Victorians were, very slowly, beginning to ask, why do we sleep? What happens when we do? And perhaps most curiously of all, what does it mean when we dream? So let's step softly into this strange intersection of velvet and voltage. Welcome to the Early Sleep Laboratories, Victorian edition. Now, calling them labs might be generous. The Victorians didn't yet have EEG machines or white coats, but they had curiosity, ink pens, and a lot of time spent watching people doze off. Because as industrial life got noisier, people started to notice just how weird sleep could be. Dreams, in particular, were fascinating. You, dear listener, have probably woken from a dream and thought, what even was that? Now imagine doing that in 1870, without Freud, without REM cycles, without a smartphone to Google it. Your options were write it down, pray about it, or assume you were being haunted by ghosts or indigestion. Luckily, a few brave thinkers push deeper. Enter the Dream Diarists. All across Victorian society, from scholars to society ladies, people started keeping meticulous records of their dreams. Not just the plot points, oh no, they went full analysis. One Londoner wrote in 1876 that she had dreamed of an enormous lemon rolling down Pall Mall, which she interpreted as an omen of sour public affairs. Another recounted riding a horse made of steam through the Crystal Palace, which honestly feels like an early steampunk novella. And then there was the wildly popular Wynero Critica Victorianus, a reprint of ancient dream interpretations with added footnotes for the modern soul. If you dreamt of water, it meant renewal. If you dreamt of birds, it meant good fortune. If you dreamt of your own funeral, well, time to cut back on the pickled onions before bed. But it wasn't just amateur dreamers. Medical men began to take interest too. Victorian physicians started documenting sleep disorders, though they didn't call them that yet. Night terrors, nocturnal wanderings, and excessive dozing were all recognized phenomena. A Cambridge doctor even theorized that excessive napping could diminish the moral faculties, which feels a little judgy, honestly. One of the strangest cases involved a railway clerk who, after surviving a train crash, developed what we'd now call narcolepsy. He would fall asleep mid-sentence, sometimes while calculating freight costs. His boss thought he was cursed. His doctor thought he was faking, but he wasn't. He was just tired, deeply, unavoidably tired, and no one knew what to do with that yet. Historians still argue whether the Victorians saw sleep as healing or suspicious. On the one hand, it was necessary. On the other, too much of it was seen as lazy, decadent, even dangerous. A truly moral person, said one minister, rises with vigor before sunrise, that he may not squander the golden hours of usefulness. Sir, please calm down. And yet, the contradictions kept coming.
While some feared too much sleep, others began prescribing it. The rest cure, which you've heard murmured through these chapters, was just the beginning. Doctors started writing formal prescriptions: 8 hours of sleep, no socializing after dinner, a glass of warm milk at dusk, no reading novels in bed, as they were known to excite the nervous system. Yes, novels were the Red Bull of 1880. But perhaps the most curious medical trend? Sleep suggestion. This was the Victorian version of hypnosis. Practitioners believed that, under a half-sleep state, patients were more open to therapeutic guidance. Think guided meditation meets seance. You'd recline, close your eyes, and the doctor, or sometimes a magnetic healer, would speak gently to you, guiding you toward relaxation, good behavior, and fewer hysterical outbursts. Helpful or manipulative? You decide. Quirky fact? Some early sleep experiments involved lighting candles in front of dozing patients to observe whether their dreams reacted to flickering shadows. One study claimed a man dreamed of being chased by fire-breathing oxen after falling asleep near a candelabra. Another felt watched by angels after sleeping beside a particularly judgmental painting of cherubs. The science was squishy. But still, progress crept forward. By the late 1890s, British medical journals began publishing articles on somnolent states and the idea of sleep architecture. One Scottish physician theorized that dreams occurred in stacked layers of the mind, with the deepest layer being pure silence. Poetic and wildly inaccurate, but he was trying. And remember, this was a time when most people still slept in 2 shifts. That's right, Victorians often practiced segmented sleep. You'd go to bed after dinner, wake up around midnight or 1 a.m., do some light reading or pray, then return to sleep until dawn. This first sleep and second sleep structure was considered normal. Only later did industrial schedules and those aggressively moral alarm clocks squeeze us into one continuous chunk. So while the scientists scribbled theories and the dreamers wrote poems, ordinary Victorians were living out their own curious sleep experiments every night, resting in fits and starts, waking in candlelight, napping in carriages, dreaming of steam horses and judgmental angels. And you, nestled in your own hush now, can feel a kinship with those long-ago sleepers. Because despite everything, gas lamps, corsets, guilt, ghost dreams, rest still found a way. Even in an era obsessed with productivity and propriety, people still surrendered, every night, to that same velvet gravity that pulls at your eyelids now. Your dreams may not involve Pall Mall citrus or steampunk horses, but they're no less important, no less strange, and no less yours. So you lie back. Let your thoughts slip gently toward the surreal, toward the flicker and flow of stories you didn't write, but somehow still belong to. Because if the Victorians taught us anything, it's that even the most tightly wound minds have to let go eventually, even if they do it while pretending they've merely fainted. You drift a little deeper now, the flicker of that Victorian candle barely registering behind your closed eyelids. Your breath has fallen into that dreamy rhythm again, the kind that means you're not quite here, not quite gone. But before you vanish entirely into sleep, let's wander sideways into something you might not expect: the role of religion in rest. Now don't worry, no fire and brimstone here. This isn't about sermons or stained glass. It's about how the Victorian relationship with faith shaped how and when people allowed themselves to stop, to pause, to nap, to sleep, and, most importantly, to rest without guilt. See, in a world that prized industriousness as a moral virtue, religion often stepped in with a peculiar contradiction. On one hand, you were expected to be constantly useful. Idle hands were, famously, the devil's workshop. But on the other hand, there was the Sabbath. The commandment was clear: 1 day a week you rest. Simple in theory, in practice, deliciously complicated. For the average Victorian, Sunday wasn't just a day off, it was the day off. Legally, economically, spiritually enforced. Shops shuttered, pubs closed, theaters darkened. And while churches buzzed with hymns and hard wooden pews, the afternoon held a quiet, sacred potential: the nap. Yes, the holiest nap of the week. After the rigors of morning worship, starched collars, long sermons, children fidgeting, there was almost always an opportunity to recline. Not in bed, of course, no. You'd rest on the sofa, or maybe in a sun-drenched chair by the window. Not napping exactly, just observing stillness. Semantics mattered a lot in the 19th century. Religious texts and manuals of the time even encouraged such rest. "Let the body be refreshed, that the spirit may rise renewed," wrote one Anglican bishop. He meant spiritually, sure, but many took that refreshment literally: feet up, bonnet off, eyes closed, just for a bit. And it wasn't just Sundays. Religious orders, especially among women, practiced holy rest daily. Nuns, for instance, kept structured schedules that included rest periods, times for contemplation, silence, even brief sleep. Not laziness, sacred rhythm. In fact, the idea that rest could be sacred was radical in a world racing toward industrial burnout. And some clergy resisted it. There were sermons that thundered against the creeping sin of daytime slumber, calling naps the enemy of discipline. One particularly energetic Welsh preacher even declared that those who drowse at midday shall awaken in sin, which honestly feels like he just needed a nap himself. But many others saw rest not as weakness, but as reverence, a way to honor the body as God's creation, to acknowledge limits, to step back from the clamor of steam whistles and ledgers and just breathe. There's a fringe story here, of course. In a small village in Yorkshire, a vicar reportedly encouraged his flock to take 15-minute sacred dozes after Sunday lunch, claiming it allowed for digestive grace. Parishioners would line their sitting rooms with quilts and Bible verses, then drift off to the sound of distant church bells. Local children called it holy snoozing. Was it widespread? Probably not. But it's an image worth holding on to. Historians still argue whether Victorian religion imposed more rest or more guilt. Did faith provide shelter from exhaustion, or did it layer duty on top of fatigue? Maybe it depended on the preacher, or the parish, or the person curled up beneath that hand-stitched sampler. And here's a curious wrinkle. Some Victorians believed sleep was a portal to the divine. Dreams weren't just mental static, they were messages, visions, warnings, or reassurances from beyond. Religious dream journals flourished, packed with accounts of angels, prophecies, and celestial tea parties. One woman claimed to have dreamed of Queen Victoria in a halo handing out loaves of bread in heaven's kitchen. Interpret that how you like. Prophetic dreams were sometimes published in pamphlets, especially during times of national crisis. Before cholera outbreaks or royal deaths, reports of ominous dreams would surge. The public lapped it up. It gave meaning to the meaningless, pattern to the chaos. Of course, not every dream was divine.
Some clergy issued warnings about impure nocturnal wanderings, encouraging prayer before bed and the avoidance of novels, again, because fictional characters apparently had a habit of sneaking into your dreams and causing moral decay. Still, sleep and the soul were deeply entangled. When someone died, they were said to have fallen asleep in the Lord. The phrase appeared in obituaries, headstones, even lullabies. Death itself was softened, reframed as eternal rest. And for the grieving, that metaphor offered comfort. The idea that loved ones weren't gone, just sleeping, peacefully, forever. And so, as bedtime neared, many Victorians treated the act of falling asleep almost like a mini-sacrament. A wash, a prayer, a careful tucking in. Some even recited full psalms aloud in bed, whispering into the dark as if setting their soul gently down for the night. So imagine it now. You, lying back in that lace-trimmed bed, the fire flickering low, a single candle left to burn until it gutters. You murmur something soft, not a sermon, just a thought, a gratitude. The kind that doesn't need to be recorded or understood, just felt. Because even now, even here in your modern hush, you can touch that same sacred stillness. The idea that sleep isn't just escape, it's offering, restoration, a quiet amen to the noise of the day. You don't need a cathedral, just your pillow and the willingness to let go. Let the room dim a little more. Let your thoughts drift like slow incense curling toward the rafters. The world will wait. Right now, you rest.
The hush around you deepens now, like velvet folding in layers. And just when you think there's nothing left to explore, the clatter of tiny hooves on cobblestone nudges your attention. You're back among the streets where carriages rattle, newspapers flutter, and small brass bells chime from the pockets of ambitious street vendors. But tonight, our focus tightens to a very particular corner of Victorian life, the children. Because if you think you're sleepy, wait until you step into the world of Victorian childhood. Spoiler, it wasn't all toy soldiers and treacle tarts. Most Victorian children were tired, deeply, chronically, and, especially for the poor, relentlessly tired. Let's begin at the top, though, the upper-class nursery. Picture this, an enormous townhouse with cold stone stairs, ticking clocks in every room, and a dedicated nursery floor far from the adults. Here, Victorian children were raised in near isolation by nannies, governesses, and occasionally a terrifying wooden rocking horse that somehow always stared at you no matter where you stood. Bedtime was sacred, predictable, ruthless. Lights out, well, gas lamps turned low, came precisely at 7 p.m., and woe betide the child who asked for water afterward. You were expected to settle down, recite your prayers, and then quietly surrender to unconsciousness. No lullabies, no bedtime stories, unless your governess felt particularly whimsical. Most nights, just the creak of the walls, the rustle of bedcloths, and the occasional muffled cough from the child in the next cot. But it wasn't all harshness. Wealthy children had access to clean sheets, warm water bottles, and the kind of bedtime routines that modern sleep coaches would envy. They even had nap times during the afternoon, especially for the youngest. Small scones, warm milk, a soft blanket. Very civilized. Meanwhile, downstairs, in the world of working-class children, it was a different reality entirely. Many of these kids didn't have bedtime. They had exhaustion, bone-deep, soot-covered, chimney-scraped exhaustion. Imagine being 8 years old and starting your day in a textile mill before dawn. The machines are deafening. The overseer is watching. You can't yawn or slow down without risking punishment, or worse. By midday, you're hungry, maybe even injured. By nightfall, your little body can barely make it home. And then what? Sleep? Not quite. First, you help with your younger siblings, then maybe some street errands,
Then, finally, if you're lucky, you collapse into a shared bed with 3 other kids under a scratchy wool blanket that smells faintly of soup and coal dust. Still, you dream. Maybe of bright things, maybe just of silence. The contrast was absurd. Some children fell asleep under hand-embroidered quilts. Others curled beside the stove on rags. And yet, across that whole strange society, a peculiar consensus still held. Naps were good for children, even essential. Schools, at least those that weren't also child labor warehouses, sometimes incorporated quiet time into the day. A few forward-thinking educators encouraged rest mats for younger students. One particularly eccentric headmistress in Cornwall insisted on post-lunchtime mental breathing space where children lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling for 20 minutes. It didn't catch on, but she tried. And here's a slightly unhinged fact. Wealthy families occasionally hired professional dream interpreters for their children. The idea was that decoding little Henrietta's nightmare about a talking teacup could reveal repressed anxieties, digestive issues, or signs of divine favor. Imagine being 6 and having your subconscious analyzed over toast.
At the same time, Victorian physicians began producing treatises on children's sleep habits. One advised that boys require less sleep than girls, for the male constitution is invigorated by activity, which is wrong on every level and also very on brand for 1875. Another believed that dreams in children were caused by immoderate cheese consumption, so if little Edward woke up screaming, the culprit was clearly his bedtime cheddar. Historians still argue whether these sleep theories were genuine concern or just fashionable nonsense. Probably both. There were real advances, like cleaner bedding materials and quieter nursery furniture, but there were also an alarming number of rules. No bedtime reading, no sugar after 4 p.m., no conversation after lights out, and absolutely no jumping on the bed unless you wanted to wake the wrath of Queen Victoria herself. Speaking of Victoria, the Queen's own parenting style included strict sleep routines. Her children, 9 in total, were raised with military precision. Bedtimes were non-negotiable. Sleep hygiene was taken seriously. One biographer even claimed her eldest son, Bertie, developed insomnia from excessive maternal formality. That's a fancy way of saying she stressed him out. Yet not all upper-class children slept well. There were nighttime anxieties, strange superstitions about shadows, and the ever-looming threat of being sent to boarding school, where bedtime meant cold dormitories and prank-prone roommates. Stories of ghost sightings at Eton and Harrow didn't help. Some parents even employed night watchers, a kind of elite babysitter, to sit beside the child's bed through the night just in case of fever, night terrors, or mysterious spiritual visitations. Imagine paying someone to sit silently in your child's room like a Victorian sleep ninja. Terrifying and oddly comforting at once. And yet, among all this, naps persisted. In drawing rooms, on school benches, even in horse-drawn prams with giant springy wheels that rattled children to sleep on cobblestone streets. There's something eternally human about that. A sleeping child, no matter the time or place or class. There's a little moment that repeats itself in dozens of Victorian diaries. A mother sitting quietly by her child's cradle, watching them breathe. The world outside noisy and wild, but here, soft, still, safe. That moment is universal. You've seen it, maybe even lived it. A hand stroking hair, a hush, a sigh, and the quiet relief of knowing someone small has finally found their way to sleep. So here you are now, lying in your own hush, remembering all those children, real and imagined, the soot-covered chimney sweeps, the silk-swathed heiresses, the half-asleep factory boys, the dreaming schoolgirls writing poems by candlelight. They've all drifted on. They've all found their silence. And maybe you too can rest a little deeper now, knowing that sleep, even when uneven or unkind, still found a place in even the noisiest corners of the past.
Let your mind grow quiet. Let your limbs grow heavy. There are no nannies here, no bells, just you and sleep, coming softly around the edges.
You're still here. Just barely, maybe. Floating somewhere between the whisper of history and the lull of your own heartbeat. But we've got just a little farther to go. Don't worry, nothing loud awaits. Only velvet curtains, oil lamps, and the curious place where medicine met the midnight hour. Tonight, we lean in closer to the world of Victorian sleep remedies, some sensible, some peculiar, and some that could probably knock out a full-grown ox. Because when counting sheep didn't cut it, and the lullabies had long since faded, Victorians turned to the doctors, the apothecaries, and, let's be honest, whatever they could find in a bottle labeled tonic. Let's begin with one of the era's more respectable figures, the household doctor. Every good middle-class home had a copy of a medical manual, often passed from mother to daughter, its pages worn and tea-stained. These books offered advice on everything from treating gout to correcting hysteria, and, of course, calming the nerves before bed. One common suggestion? Warm milk with nutmeg. Simple, harmless, tastes like sleep in a teacup. Others recommended a hot bath followed by a brisk towel rub, and, if possible, a stroll around the garden to clear the humors. That's fine, fresh air, even if the air was half coal dust. But when the bath didn't work, Victorians turned to stronger methods. Enter laudanum. This sweet, reddish liquid, an opium tincture, was sold in chemists' shops like candy, marketed to housewives, poets, soldiers, and even teething infants. Yes, really, laudanum promised deep sleep, dulled pain, and possibly prophetic dreams. It also came with a charming list of side effects, including addiction, dizziness, and, death. Still, it was enormously popular and effective if unconsciousness was your goal. Imagine yourself in a dim Victorian bedroom, a decanter of laudanum glinting on the nightstand, right next to a dog-eared copy of Middlemarch and a half-burned candle. You sip a teaspoon, feel the warmth spread, the world softens, your limbs hum. You don't dream, you sink. Historians still argue whether the popularity of opiates was driven by true insomnia or the unrelenting pace of Victorian life. Probably both. There's something telling about a society so obsessed with productivity also needing industrial-strength sleep aids. And then there were the tonics. Oh, the tonics! Bottled in every imaginable shape, with handwritten labels and grandiose claims. Dr. Fenwick's sleep syrup, Calm and Composure Essence, Nightingale's Nocturnal Nerve Elixir. Many were just mixtures of alcohol and herbs. Others included ingredients like chloroform, belladonna, or morphine. One even promised restorative dreams via mineral infusions, which sounded suspiciously like someone dropped a rock in your tea. There's a particularly odd case from 1878, when a gentleman from Kent claimed his insomnia was cured by sleeping with a raw potato in each sock. Earth magic, he called it. His letters were published in The Gentleman's Almanac. Several readers wrote back, saying it worked. Historians chalk it up to placebo and cold feet. Others swore by hypnotism, not the swinging pocket watch stuff, but actual physician-led sessions where you'd be coaxed into a trance, told to let the troubles of your day dissolve, and then quietly left to drift off. Some Victorian hospitals offered this as treatment for sleeplessness, particularly among veterans and nervously afflicted spinsters, which is both charming and condescending. Even Queen Victoria herself was rumored to have consulted with sleep mesmerists during periods of mourning. Whether she truly believed in it or just needed someone calm in the room is unclear. And let's not forget herbalism. Chamomile, lavender, valerian root, herbs we still use today were staples in the Victorian sleep pantry. Tucked into sachets, brewed into teas, even stitched into pillowcases. A good housekeeper knew her bedtime herbs by scent and strength. Some even believed in sleep-inducing furniture. There were chairs with special curves to align the energies, beds with magnetized frames to encourage cellular tranquility.
And one inventor filed a patent for a vibrational slumber table, a kind of humming nightstand that was supposed to lull the sleeper with soft mechanical purring. It sold 3 units. And here's the weirdest one of all, the dream helmet. An 1890 contraption worn like a leather aviator cap, with interior compartments for rosewater, mint oil, and whisper tubes that played recorded affirmations while you slept. "You are calm," it would murmur. "You are worthy." Honestly, that sounds kinda great. Of course, not all remedies were so direct. Some doctors simply recommended altering the schedule. "Rest between 2:30 and 4 in the afternoon," they said, "and the night shall yield fewer disturbances." Ah, the sanctioned nap strikes again. That same window of afternoon stillness shows up again and again as the golden hour of repose. So picture it. A woman in her parlor, resting behind drawn curtains, a teaspoon of lavender syrup on her tongue. A man reclining in his study, pretending to read the Times, but really just snoozing, the dog curled at his feet. A servant girl in the scullery, stealing 5 minutes beside the warm stove, eyes fluttering. Everyone chasing rest. Everyone trying their own version of peace. And sure, some methods were dubious, but the instinct? Universal. To turn off the day, to unspool the mind, to let something bigger or softer take over. You might smile now, lying here in your own quiet. You don't need chloroform, or hypnotists, or magnetized furniture. Just your own breath, the gentle pull of gravity, and maybe the faintest trace of something floral in the air. Lavender, perhaps. Or is that just your imagination? You don't need remedies tonight. Not really. Just a story to soften the edges. A reminder that even the most wound-up minds eventually untangle. So let yours drift. Let your thoughts blur at the edges, like the handwriting on those old tonic bottles. Let the past dissolve, like laudanum in tea. There is no urgency here, no cure to find. Only this moment, and the softness waiting just beyond it.
Still with me? The hush is deeper now. Time's grown syrupy, like a candle's final stretch before the wick gives in. But we've reached a strangely comforting corner of the Victorian sleepscape, the sacred, peculiar rituals that surrounded the act of actually going to bed. Because it wasn't just about sleeping. No. In Victorian life, going to bed was an event, a winding down ritual filled with rules, routines, and just the right amount of Gothic flourish. Let's start where most of them did, with the lighting. You move slowly through a hallway dimly lit by gas lamps, shadows fluttering like moth wings on the wallpaper. One by one, the flames are extinguished, snuffed with a brass cap or gently turned down. No switches to flip, no cozy bedside lamp, just the ceremonial dimming of the world. Candles are lit in their place, often one per person. A taper held carefully in hand, wax catching in silver holders. You tread carefully because the last thing you need is to trip in a corset while holding fire. Then comes the unbuttoning. And yes, this was often a team effort. In upper-class homes, a lady's maid or valet would assist. Dozens of hooks and fastenings, gowns layered over petticoats, layered over chemises. Going to bed could take 20 minutes just in wardrobe reversal. And then, at last, your night clothes. White, long, often monogrammed. Nightshirts with high collars. Bed caps tied under the chin. You look like you've stepped out of a Charles Dickens Christmas special. And maybe you have. Don't forget your bed socks, or your handkerchief, or your personal warming pan, a metal saucer filled with hot coals slid between the sheets to banish the chill. Historians still argue whether this made the bed more cozy or just smelled like burnt toast. Probably both. Meanwhile, in humbler homes, the rituals were simpler, but no less ritualized. Boots off first, then trousers, maybe a quick basin rinse, cold water, rough towel, brisk scrub. You'd rub your hands before bed just to make sure the soap smell didn't stick too strong.
Then curl into the straw-filled mattress beside whoever else shared the bed that night. Siblings, cousins, or sometimes a lodger. Yes, Victorian families often shared beds. Even unrelated adults might bunk together to save on rent or keep warm. You learned to sleep motionless, quietly, facing the wall. Upper-class households had entire manuals on bed etiquette. Things like, always enter from the left side, never cross the bed with outdoor shoes, and do not speak once in repose. That last one sounds delightful. There was also the matter of prayer. Most Victorians, especially in more pious circles, ended the day on their knees. A soft mumble of thanks, a plea for safety, perhaps a whispered hope for pleasant dreams. Children were coached to repeat, "Now I lay me down to sleep," with hands clasped and eyes tightly shut. Even non-religious families often kept the tradition in some form. A silent moment, a candle flickering low, you kneeling in your long white gown, hoping not to pass out before Amen. Then the bed itself.
Victorian beds were often enormous, four-posted, draped in fabric heavy enough to block both light and whispers. Curtains pulled closed created a tiny private world, your own midnight tent. Some people believed the curtains trapped warmth. Others just liked the feeling of being cocooned. Still others, especially among the anxious elite, believed it protected them from night spirits. Yup, spirits. There were guides about how to arrange the room to avoid inviting nocturnal visitations. No mirrors facing the bed, no shoes turned upside down, and absolutely no letting your bed linens drag on the floor. It invited unwanted energies, according to one domestic guide. Quirky tidbit: some Victorians kept an onion under the bed for vapors, and just in case the ghost of your great-aunt dropped by with a cough. Let's not forget the pillows. Feather-stuffed, often enormous. But here's the kicker. They believed you shouldn't sleep flat. A slightly elevated position encouraged proper breathing and prevented dream disturbance. One sleep manual suggested you arrange your pillows like a chaise longue, but horizontal. You do your best, stacking them high like some kind of bedtime throne. Then slide in under the covers. The bedclothes are heavy, really heavy. Blankets, quilts, maybe even a coverlet or two. Victorian winters were no joke, and central heating still decades away for most. You lie still, very still. That was part of the ritual too. Movement was discouraged. Fidgeting meant anxiety. You were trained, especially if raised by strict households, to settle and remain motionless. Which sounds impossible unless you've been hauling coal since dawn or stitching lace for 12 hours straight. For some, the stillness was spiritual, a form of surrender. One sleep preacher called it the evening death, from which we rise renewed. That's dramatic but poetic. And for the Romantics, bed was a chance for reflection. Journals appeared on nightstands, leather-bound, ink-stained. Final thoughts of the day, recorded by candlelight. Some even timed their journaling to coincide with the clock's final chime, midnight. Then the pen is capped, the journal closed. Good night. But not quite yet. There's one final detail, the soundscape. In cities, you'd hear distant horses, muffled conversation, the occasional whistle of a night watchman. In the country, owls, wind, the creak of wooden beams. And, sometimes, silence, thick and absolute. That silence was both comfort and terror. Because when you strip away all the bustle of the day, no factory whistles, no gossip, no fire crackle, you're left alone with your thoughts, which is perhaps why so many Victorians filled their beds with noise, whispered prayers, soft lullabies, a spouse's rhythmic breathing. Even snoring, somehow, became a lullaby. But eventually, even those sounds faded, and the ritual ended.
The last candle flickered, a final exhale, the great sighing collapse of a body giving up the day. That was Victorian sleep. A little dramatic, a little inconvenient, a little overstuffed. But beneath all the superstition, starch, and heavy blankets, a very human longing. To let go, to feel safe, to find rest after a world that never really slowed down. Just like you now. Your own bedtime ritual, whatever shape it takes, mirrors theirs. You've dimmed the lights, you've turned the page, maybe even curled on your side just right. There's nothing else to do, no hooks to unfasten, no onions under your bed, just stillness, just breath. Let it settle around you like a curtain.
So, here we are, the last thread of the tapestry, the final exhale of a world once bustling with steam and starch, now softened by shadows and sleep. You've followed every creaky hallway, every overstuffed featherbed, every half-whispered superstition, and now you're standing, quietly, on the edge of the Victorian dream itself. Because this last stretch is about what happened after the eyelids closed, after the tonics kicked in, after the prayers, the nightcaps, and the turning down of every single gas lamp. This is what they dreamed. Or, more precisely, what they thought dreams meant. Victorian culture was obsessed with dreams, not just as idle brain static, but as deeply meaningful messages, sometimes divine, sometimes unhinged, always ripe for interpretation. Entire books were published on dream analysis, titles like Onira Critica Britannica and The Dreamer's Dictionary for Ladies and Gentlemen. Inside, page after page explaining how dreaming of sheep meant good fortune, whereas dreaming of shoes meant someone close to you was about to lie. Harsh. They categorized dreams, prophetic, nonsense, indigestion-based, and believed in true dreams, ones that came between 3 a.m. when the soul was closest to the ether. Victorian logic was endearingly inconsistent. One sleep scientist, yes, they had those, claimed that your dreams were simply your brain sorting the detritus of the day. Another insisted dreams were glimpses into the psychic planes of the yet-to-be. In simpler terms, time travel via pillow. Historians still argue whether Victorian dream theory influenced psychology or merely reflected superstition. But there's no denying that dreams mattered. People recorded them meticulously in journals, shared them over tea, sometimes even brought them to their doctors. There's a story of a London grocer in 1882 who dreamed he'd drown in a vat of currant wine. He quit his job the next day, took up locksmithing instead, lived to 93. And while that's anecdotal, it's not unique. Victorians made life decisions based on dreams, travel plans, wedding dates, medical procedures. It wasn't just mysticism, it was practical paranoia. But maybe, just maybe, they were onto something. Because when you've spent the day bent over embroidery or hauling bricks or biting your tongue at a dinner party, sleep isn't just escape, it's rebellion. And the dreams that follow, well, they're your victory parade, in the dark, in slippers. Of course, not all dreams were pleasant. Nightmares were considered a medical issue. Night terrors were blamed on everything from repressed emotion to meat pies eaten too late. There were even anti-nightmare amulets, tiny sachets stuffed with rosemary and sewn into the hems of nightgowns. And then there were the sleepwalkers. One newspaper described them as moon-struck travelers of the unconscious. Romantic until someone walked out a second-story window. In fact, sleepwalking was so common it became theatrical. Literally, plays featured it, artists painted it. There's even an opera, La Sonbumbala, a tale of a young woman who sleepwalks into tragedy and misunderstanding. Naturally. But back to the dreams. They weren't always solitary. Some believed in shared dreaming. Two people sleeping in the same room might influence each other's dreams, like tuning forks vibrating in harmony. One Victorian letter writer swore she and her cousin both dreamed of a swan flying through a stained glass window on the same night. Her conclusion? They were destined to marry the same man. They did not.
Still, the idea persisted. That sleep wasn't entirely private. That in those soft, drifting hours, something connected us. A thread through the dark, a breath shared across time. And that idea, romantic as it is, brings us right back to you. Because you've been dreaming this whole time, haven't you? Awake, sure, but gently, like someone drifting in and out of their own mind, following cobblestone footsteps into the past. And now that dream, the story, the sound, the slow unraveling, is almost complete. But before we wind it down, let's take one last look around. You're in a room, wallpapered, flickering. The air is soft with lavender and coal ash. Outside, a horse clops by on the slick street. Inside, everything is hushed. You're lying in a four-poster bed. The curtains are drawn. A warming pan rests near your feet, still faintly ticking. On your nightstand is a small notebook, open to a half-written line about a dream involving pears and betrayal. You're not sure what it meant. Above you, the ceiling breathes shadows. Below you, the mattress creaks like an old friend shifting to get more comfortable. You let yourself relax. This is the final ritual. Not a cure, not a spell, just the long, slow permission to let go. The Victorian world, for all its rigidity and bustle, understood this moment. They wrapped it in fabric and framed it with firelight. They made sleep sacred. Sometimes ridiculous, sometimes dangerous, often unnecessarily complicated, but always sacred. And now, so do you. Because here you are, still, in the quiet, letting your own story soften at the edges. The journey is done. The gaslights are dim. Even the street outside has grown quiet. So let's drift there together now, to that place where time doesn't matter, where beds never squeak, and where nobody asks you to explain your weird swan dream. Just sleep. And now there's nowhere left to go. The story is told. The city's gone still. The windows are dark. The footsteps faded. You've arrived, exactly where you need to be. You feel your breath slow, feather light, your muscles warm and loose. The rhythm of the past has faded into the hush of now. You don't need to hold anything. Not the facts, not the details, not even your thoughts. Let them go, like a shawl slipping from your shoulders. The pillow beneath you is softer now, somehow. The blankets heavier, familiar, like arms, like gravity, like peace. Let your eyes close fully, if they haven't already. Let the last of the candlelight fade from your imagination. No more cobblestones, no more ticking clocks. Just a calm, endless room where nothing is expected of you. Not now, not ever. You are safe, you are warm, you are free from every version of the day. And when you dream, if you dream, let it be gentle, let it be kind. Let it carry you, not away, but inward, to the quietest, calmest part of yourself. There's no need to come back quickly. No alarms, no gasps, just a slow return whenever you're ready. But, for now, just rest.